Tonight, vaccine requirements on the firing line.
Congress has not empowered OSHA to impose a vaccine mandate on businesses.
The Supreme Court takes up the president's vaccine mandates affecting nearly 100 million Americans. Plus, President Biden touting a success on the new December jobs report out today.
The economy as a whole is stronger than before the pandemic.
And deja vu.
Bill pursues a vision of ejecting us from the theater.
After Iranian drone strikes this week against U.S. troops in Iraq. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation. I am John Jessup. We'll get to our top story in a moment, but first, the three white men convicted of murdering Ahmad Arbury received their sentences earlier this afternoon. Travis Mcmichael and his father, Gregory Mcmichael, both receiving life sentences without parole, plus 20 years in prison for chasing down and murdering the 25-year-old unarmed black man they confronted while out for a jog. William Roddy Bryan, also convicted of Arbury's murder, received a life sentence with the possibility of parole. The judge, Timothy Walmsley, pointed to a total lack of remorse from the Mcmichaels in the slaying that drew national attention, even after the release of a video showing the three men chasing Arbury in pickup trucks on February 23rd of 2020. Arbury ran from the men in the Satilla Shores neighborhood of Glenn County, Georgia for 5 minutes before Travis Mcmichael fatally shot him with a 12-gauge shotgun. Well, back to our top story. How far can the government go in a national emergency like the COVID pandemic? That's the question the Supreme Court will answer after today's oral arguments examining the constitutionality of President Biden's emergency executive order. If it goes into effect, it would force private businesses with 100 or more employees to submit to mandatory vaccinations or weekly testing. A decision affecting more than 80 million American workers, even as COVID cases soar. CBN's Caitlin Burke is covering today's proceeding. Caitlin, you listened to the oral arguments. What exactly were the legal parties asking the court to do?
Well, John, attorneys arguing against the mandate want the Supreme Court to issue an immediate stay, which would halt enforcement of OSHA's requirement that employees vaccinate or test. The federal government says these emergency rules need to go into effect immediately because of the grave danger posed by COVID.
OSHA had statutory authority to rely on those measures here, which it found would save 6,500 lives and prevent 250,000 hospitalizations in just 6 months. Exposure to COVID-19 on the job is the biggest threat to workers in OSHA's history.
Challengers to the mandate acknowledge that COVID is dangerous, but argue this kind of sweeping rule is outside of OSHA's jurisdiction.
OSHA's economy-wide one-size-fits-all mandate covering 84 million Americans is not a necessary, indispensable use of OSHA's extraordinary emergency power, which this court has recognized is narrowly circumscribed.
Scott Keller represents the National Federation of Independent Business. He says the mandate will inflict irreparable harm on hundreds of thousands of businesses.
As soon as businesses have to put out their plans, and this takes effect, workers will quit. That itself will be a permanent worker displacement that will ripple through the national economy.
Several justices argued back that COVID was the greater threat.
We are now having deaths at an unprecedented amount. Catching COVID keeps people out of the workplace for extraordinary periods of time.
This is a policy that basically says we are still confronting thousands of people dying every time we look around. And so we're going to put into place the policy that we know works best, which is to strongly incentivize vaccination and to insist that unvaccinated people will wear masks and test.
Another question being considered, whether OSHA has the authority to wield this kind of emergency power without a direct order from Congress.
Congress would have to clearly state in a statute if it wanted to give an occupational health agency the power to require employees to get certain medical treatment.
The federal government argues that a law passed in 1970 has already done that.
If you look at the plain text of the statute, we think that OSHA's standard clearly falls within the terms that Congress enacted. COVID-19 is a grave danger, it's a physically harmful agent, and the agency found that these measures are essential to protect workers. So we think that the statutory language already exists.
That was 50 years ago that you're saying Congress acted. I don't think it had COVID in mind. That was almost closer to the Spanish flu than it is to today's problem.
Now, OSHA typically identifies a workplace danger and then regulates it. But here, the president decided to regulate a danger and then told OSHA to find a work-related basis for doing so.
Benjamin Flowers, Ohio's Solicitor General, stressed that OSHA's action is illegal and therefore must be stopped.
The court may decide that there's a better way to unwind the illegal action than a judicial action. What it can't do is say, we judge that these are very, in our view, this illegal action will lead to good effects, and so we will allow that to happen.
Now, the justices also heard arguments on a mandate that specifically affects federally funded healthcare facilities. That requirement would impact more than 17 million workers. There's no word yet on when the justices will come down with the decision, but with the mandate set to go into effect next week, it will likely be soon. John?
All right, CBN's Caitlin Burke. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Here now, Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel. Matt, welcome to Faith Nation. I know you listened to the arguments before the court today. Based on the back and forth between counsel and the justices, does it give you any indication on which way the court might rule on these two cases?
You can never ultimately predict from the oral argument. Sometimes the oral argument seems to go one way and then the opinion comes out the other way. But I think predicting, if you will, on this particular case, it seems pretty clear that regarding OSHA, that's going to get a majority of judges to block it. I think OSHA's requirement with regards to regulating in the workplace, something that is not specifically hazardous to the workplace outside of other areas, is really something that is a problem from OSHA's standpoint going beyond its constitutional authority. On the other one, however, it does regulate a specific industry as opposed to OSHA regulating every single thing as a one-size-fits-all template. And that is an industry of healthcare, although it regulates everything within healthcare with that one-size-fits-all. So it's got some problems as well. It's unclear what the court's going to do with regards to that. Based upon some of the questions from Roberts and Kavanaugh and Barrett, it may be that that's going to be a much closer call and possibly could be upheld. Right now, it's at least struck down in half of the states, a little bit more than half of the states, and the other states don't have injunctions against it yet. What we do know is that all the courts that have reviewed it did enjoin it so far.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Another difficult question to answer, but how quickly do we expect to hear a decision in either or both of the cases, given that the mandates themselves are supposed to take effect quite soon?
Well, in the OSHA one, it actually begins on Monday, January 10, at least for masking, and then some of the penalties don't get into effect until later into February. But based upon some of the questions before the court, there was seemingly openness to do a quick administrative order to at least temporarily block it so that they could have more time to review the substance of the case. And that may be what we see the court doing.
Matt, final thought here in the minute or so that we have left. You know, there's a deepening political divide in America over vaccine mandates as we head into, it's hard to believe, year 3 of the pandemic. Is a ruling from the highest court in the land going to be the final word on the subject, or will we likely see more?
Oh, there's going to be a lot more, because you not only have these mandates, you also have the one regarding federal contractors. That's been enjoined by all the courts that have reviewed it, 4 judges, but it hasn't made its way to the Supreme Court. That will do that sometime later this year. But in addition to that, you also have all the private and other scenarios of employers that are mandating, whether either under the mandate or on their own, and those are being litigated in the courts, particularly on religious free exercise grounds. And by the way, you know, the other thing you have is the military mandate. We've got a major case against the military. And in fact, today is when the military has to report regarding the religious exemptions. And frankly, I think what we're going to see is that not one religious exemption has been granted in the military. So that's still ongoing. We're going to get some, I think, injunctions coming up against the military in the near future.
A lot of cases in the mix. All right, Matt Staver with Liberty Counsel, thank you for your time today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, the latest economic numbers show a mixed bag. The U.S. economy added far fewer jobs than expected, but the employment rate is down, according to the latest jobs report. CBN's Tara Mergener has more on what it all means.
U.S. employers added a modest 199,000 jobs last month, but the unemployment rate dropped sharply. This as millions of Americans choose not to go back to work and businesses cannot find enough help. President Biden touting the latest jobless numbers as a sign his economic plan is working.
Today, America is the only leading economy in the world where the economy as a whole is stronger than before the pandemic.
The Labor Department report shows unemployment fell from 4.2% to 3.9% in December, a sign more people found jobs last month. Biden blasted Republicans for not supporting his economic agenda.
A lot of people are still suffering, they say. Well, they are. Or that I'm not focused on inflation. Malarkey. They want to talk down the recovery because they voted against the legislation that made it happen.
But to the surprise of some economists, job growth faltered in December with only a slight gain in hiring reported by businesses. The latest figures represent the second consecutive month of worse than expected growth.
We were forecasting a 440,000 rise in non-farm payrolls. So when it came in at 199, I was very surprised, thinking, well, gee, it's deja vu all over again, because the November number was expected to be strong, and it came in at about half of what had been projected.
The figures suggest that despite high demand for workers, employers are still struggling to attract new hires. The labor participation rate remains unchanged at nearly 62%. Some blaming COVID and the surge of the Omicron variant, lack of child care for parents, or too many financial incentives by the feds to stay home. Critics say the next report could be even worse.
It's a big miss. That's a fact. This does not reflect the weakness in the economy after the Omicron surge. It reflects weakness before the surge. In other words, by the time we get the next set of numbers, we'll probably see an even worse jobs picture.
The last time job growth was this slow was 1 year ago, when businesses slashed 300,000 jobs. And analysts are already warning that this month and next month could be slow as well, as Omicron cases force many workers to stay home and quarantine. In Washington, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
All right. Thank you, Tara. Coming up, how the Omicron variant is impacting hospitalizations and why the pandemic is being what's called a tale of two variants. Next on Faith Nation. And welcome back. For most of the world, Christmas is a memory from a couple of weeks ago or something to look forward to in December. But many Orthodox churches are celebrating Christmas today based on a decision made over 400 years ago. The White House highlighting the holiday with a message wishing Orthodox Christians a Merry Christmas. President Biden also reaffirming America's commitment to religious freedom, acknowledging that Orthodox Christians around the world face persecution and discrimination. Orthodox Christians make up around 12% of the world's Christians and adhere to a nearly 2,000-year-old Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian calendar, the standard international calendar most of the Western world uses today. Well, on the health front, the pandemic is becoming a tale of two variants. The majority of COVID-19 hospitalizations in some parts of the U.S. are actually due to patients coming in for reasons other than COVID. But when they do come in, they also test positive for COVID-19 as well. According to an analysis by the Washington Post, many of those cases are from the less severe Omicron variant, whereas the more lethal Delta variant still accounts for more patients who are fighting to survive the effects of the virus. Well, here with us now is Lori Johnson, CBN medical reporter. Lori, the evidence suggests the new Omicron variant presents much milder symptoms than we've seen from the Delta variant. I guess the question is, as we've seen the variants evolve, what comes next?
Well, unfortunately, John, they've already identified a new variant in France. It's very, very sparse. Fewer than a dozen people have it. It doesn't have a name yet from the Greek alphabet, but nothing to really worry about at this time. You know, we saw Lambda and Mu. Those turned out to be not very concerning. And in fact, you know, this virus and many other viruses constantly mutate. Thousands of mutations are noted. And so just because a virus mutates doesn't necessarily mean that there is reason for concern. But health officials say, yes, we can definitely expect more mutations.
Lori, new op-eds this week in the Journal of American Medical Association by former advisors to President Biden are urging the president to consider adopting what's called a new normal of living with the coronavirus indefinitely rather than simply wiping it out. Is that a viable option?
It absolutely is a viable option. We really don't have much choice. That is absolutely what's going to happen, according to most health experts. And basically, this is a very difficult thing for the Biden administration to understand because, remember, he campaigned on the, I'm going to shut down the virus. I'm going to shut down the virus. How many times did we hear that? He ran on that. He won on that, a lot of political experts would say. And so it's difficult for the Biden administration for political reasons to come out and say, actually, we were wrong. We're not going to shut down the virus. The virus is never going to go away. But eventually, either he or other medical experts are going to have to come out and express this to the American people, or they're just going to find out on their own that it's going to be with us probably forever, just like the flu. And that's what we call an endemic, not a pandemic, an endemic, which means it comes around every year. People get vaccinated for it. Sadly, some people who are at very high risk will die from it. This is what we see every year with the flu, but it's probably going to be something like that. So coronavirus likely is here to stay.
You know, speaking of difficulties for the administration, the CDC is facing criticism for mixed and often confusing guidance over isolation and testing. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky made the rounds on the morning shows to try to clear some of that up. Lori, what is the current guidance over a positive test result, and why does it keep changing?
Well, it keeps changing because this Omicron variant really has changed things a lot. So what we now know is that if you do become sick with coronavirus, in many cases, John, it's not that big of a deal. If you've been vaccinated and boosted, you can oftentimes just recover at home like a cold or like the flu, like we talked about before. And since so many people are getting it these days, I mean, how many people do you and I both know who are sick with coronavirus right now? Luckily, not that sick. So they changed the guidance based on that because of the way that the Omicron variant has changed. And to answer your question about what is it these days, it is if you are test positive for COVID and you don't have any symptoms, then you only need to quarantine for 5 days instead of 10 days, which is what it was before. But the real red flag for so many people was there was no testing option, which means after 5 days, you can just re-enter society and not even have to take a test and get a negative test. And that's a real problem for some people because a third of people are still contagious after that.
All right, Lori, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
When we come back, escalating tension in the Middle East and what it means for the Biden administration's nuclear talks with Iran. Welcome back. Iranian-backed forces launched 2 drone strikes against U.S. troops in Iraq this week. The Islamic regime wants all U.S. forces to leave the region, and they're threatening to keep up the attacks until they get what they want. CBN contributor Chuck Holton brings us more.
On December 9th, 2021, the U.S.-led combat mission in Iraq came to an official end after 6,850 days. That momentous occasion, however, did not equal a ticket home for the 2,500 U.S. troops still stationed in the country. Neither did it signal a change of mission for 900 troops currently serving in Syria.
I expect that we will continue to provide some limited support to the Iraqis going forward. But again, it's going to be essentially, by and large, it's going to be a non-combatant process.
Remaining forces will pivot to a slightly different role, one they call advise and assist. They'll be providing support to Iraqi forces in the effort to stamp out the enduring vestiges of ISIS, which was officially defeated in 2017, but is lately making a comeback. One neighbor clearly wants the U.S. out of the region.
Still pursues a vision of ejecting us from the theater, and they see the principal battleground for that as being in Iraq. And I believe they are under the view that they can increase friction in Iraq to where we will leave, and that will not affect the nuclear negotiations that are underway. That's not a military issue. That's an issue for U.S. national leadership. But I think it's a dangerous position for the Iranians to maintain, because I think they're not going to be able to decouple those two things.
Iran's president recently called for former President Trump and his top advisors to be charged with the 2020 killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani.
The then President of America, which is the main aggressor, murderer, and a criminal, must be prosecuted and killed. A sentence of God must be executed against him.
During this massive memorial held in Tehran on the anniversary of Soleimani's death, American and Israeli flags were burned, and the familiar chant of "Death to America" echoed through the streets. Adding to regional instability, popular mobilization forces backed by Iran had been threatening violence if the U.S. did not pull out by the end of 2021. Now they're making good on those threats. Since the beginning of the year, missiles have been fired at U.S. bases in the region on an almost daily basis. So far, no injuries have been reported, as the killer drones were brought down by counter-rocket, artillery, and mortar batteries, which can fire more than 4,000 rounds per minute. The U.S. is now striking back in retaliation, which shows the combat phase of this conflict might not be over after all. For CBN News, I'm Chuck Holton.
Finally tonight, among the miracles of Jesus, feeding the 5,000 with just 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. But have you heard about the 2 stranded motorists helping to feed 500? During the recent snowstorm, stranded, cold and hungry, without any food or water, one eagle-eyed Maryland couple noticed a nearby bread truck that was also stuck on I-95. The couple called Schmidt Baking Company and within 20 minutes heard back from the CEO himself.
She contacted them, told them the situation, and the owner of the truck told the driver to open it up and start handing out food to people.
The Good Samaritans handed out, get this, nearly 600 loaves to other stranded drivers there on I-95. The company CEO saying it was the easiest decision he's ever made. And who says there isn't good in the world today? Well, thanks so much for watching Faith Nation. We hope to see you right back here next week. Have a great weekend, everyone.